Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our online Ratio Christi Symposium. We are already ending our first week with the last two lectures of the first week tonight. Yes, so welcome. Now, Ratio Christi is a campus student ministry where we seek to equip Christian students apologetically to be able to defend the Christian faith and also give reasons for following Jesus Christ, whether that might be historical, philosophical, theological, or scientific reasons. And also we equip the students to be able to engage with the culture and the big ideas that surrounds them on the university campuses. So that's what we do as a ministry. If you have any more questions about us, please visit our website, ratiochristi.co.za. There you will be able to see all the information you need. We also publish weekly informative articles on there, so you can go and have a look there. We also have free ebooks that you can download on the website. And so please go and check out the website. And then I would also like to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already done so. Now tonight, I want to welcome Louise Mabille. She is a dear friend of Ratio Christi. She completed her first PhD on Friedrich Nietzsche, and she also authored 2 books on him. And then she completed a second PhD on Milton and also the English Reformation. Currently, she's doing research on the relationship between religion and science. And furthermore, Louise is really a dear friend of Ratio Christi South Africa. She helps us out wherever she can. And so she's known to most of us. Louise, thank you very much for taking the time. And thank you for being here. And welcome as well to you too.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a great privilege to have this opportunity, and I only hope I can do justice to the topic.
No, thank you very much. So for the listeners out there, please feel free to ask questions in the live feed, since we will have time for Q&A as well at the end. So you can ask questions to Louise. And Louise, please, you can kick us off.
Okay. Now, okay. Freud once described neuroses as the endless replay of an original trauma. It would be possible to describe modernity's many efforts to make sense of the world in terms of the many attempts to overcome the wound left by what Friedrich Nietzsche termed the death of God. Freud also held that people usually lack the courage to deal with the trauma directly. They tend to do so by proxy or substitution. Thus, we find ourselves in a strange world where which seems prepared to engage every aspect of Christianity except Jesus Christ. Among the most pervasive efforts to defer engagement with Christ is a line of thought which runs from the late 18th century through Marx and the hippies of the 1960s to the contemporary social justice movement, a line of resentment which at once privileges individualism and obliterates it. Like many traditions, it has its moments of greatness, but in our very decadent age, it has become something truly nihilistic and destructive. I'm going to examine the social justice movement at the hand of what I would regard as its progenitor, its ancestor, Romanticism. It is difficult to believe that something with its roots in natural beauty could manifest itself in such a divisive and almost provocatively sinful way. According to Robert C. Solomon, one of the most decisive moments in Western history occurred when the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau took a walk in the woods of Vincennes in the south of France. And that is what we see here in the PowerPoint. Now, Rousseau, surrounded by nature, became overwhelmed by the goodness of the natural world. It was so rich, so pure, so varied and innocent. This goodness, he thought, was not simply linked to the fauna and flora, but encompassed everything, including his own nature and those of everyone else on the planet. He writes, I felt overcome by 1,000 flashes of enlightenment, a positive giddiness resembling intoxication. I sank down in a state of agitation, and upon getting up, my jacket was wet with tears. And here we have history's first drama queen. This insight, the insight which inspired this, also inspired the realization that people were essentially good. And it was the corrupting influence of civilization which made them evil. Just a moment. There we go. This brings us to one of the most famous sayings in philosophy, the dictum by Rousseau, that man was born free and good, and everywhere he is in chains. In his first discourse, Rousseau argues that it was civilized people which were essentially false, artificial, and deceptive, and that it is necessary to return or recover a true original self behind the artifice of the church, manners, institutions, theatricality, and high culture. He coined the phrase the alienation, something which people accustomed to Marxism and social justice theory should immediately recognize. A term which would be used to Marx to indicate his version of a fall from an ideal pre-industrial society to a hierarchical, unjust, capitalized, and technologically based society. However, both Rousseau and Marx are dishonest about the roots of their narrative. The theologically literate among you will immediately recognize a soteriological pattern here. Christian soteriology speaks of our estrangement from God through an original act of disobedience, and then proceeds to find a solution to this breach in the person of Christ, which means that we once again have the hope of becoming one with the originary state of things. The word atonement itself literally means, in essence, at one mint. However, it, as a theme, soteriology is a pattern of thought already present in Plato, and it runs like a thread throughout not only European history, but through all the entirety of the monotheistic tradition. It may be relevant to consider that the victory of the Taliban in Afghanistan could also be viewed in this light, as well as the earlier revolution in Iran in 1979, because ultimately both of them, both occasions imply a rather rigid form of soteriology, a kind of alienation from an originally theologically pure state. However, it is in Europe, with its history of secularization, it occurs in a myriad of ways. And Jean-Jacques Rousseau plays a very important part in the modernization and the secularization of this particular theme. The key theme to any soteriology is that there's a way in through which we can return to the one original truth, and in essence live happily ever after. Rousseau is a classic soteriological thinker, in that he politicizes the recovery of an original order from which humanity has unjustly and arbitrarily been alienated. Now, if we think of thinkers like Karl Lewis and in our own time, Charles Taylor, you will see that these thinkers point out that a great many themes in modern European thought is in fact a reenactment or a translation of Christian ideals into more blandly universalist and moralistic language. And this certainly leads one to think that we as Christians should be very careful in how we engage secular thought, because to some extent, all secular, there is no such thing as purely secular or humanistic ideas, but humanism itself has its roots in Christianity. According to the soteriological model, broadly speaking, and I'm talking about the secular model now, justice is natural and absolute. It is not a kind of law as we have in the Thomistic natural law tradition, which goes back to the ancients and particularly Aristotle, but an original state of affairs, pre-social, pre-political, and of course, lest we forget, pre-capitalist. The presence of injustice is couched in terms which sometimes comes uncomfortably close to the Christian ideal of a satanic evil, as the writer Susan Neiman also points out. Evil in her book Evil in Modern Times, the incredible demonization of groups can to some extent be traced to a metaphysics of good and evil, where there's an absolute contrast between pure goodness and pure evil. Now, soteriology is usually couched in terms of an attack on those who are seen as being unjustly in power. In our own times, this naturally designate figures like whites, Christians, men, and the like. However, it should be mentioned in passing that soteriology can also manifest itself in scapegoat theory, as René Girard has pointed out, and the case in point would then necessarily be Nazi Germany. However, that's not our topic of today. Rousseau is the philosophical father of Romanticism. Seen purely as a broad aesthetic or even philosophical tendency in modern art, it is responsible for a variety of artworks that most of us will recognize immediately. Some of them are among the greatest accomplishments in human history. And I think particularly here in terms of music, and the quintessential romantic composer would be Ludwig van Beethoven. And we think of poets like Goethe. To Romanticism, we also owe the idea of absolute originality, the author in control of his text, romantic heroes like Napoleon, and nationalist expressions like the Marseillaise in France, the national anthem in France, but is through and through a product of romantic inspiration. And it is in itself not something that we should view with the same kind of suspicion with which we view social justice. Nietzsche tends to oppose romanticism to classicism, whereas classicism places the emphasis on form, telos, the impersonal, theatricality, surface, and reason. The romantics tend to emphasize feeling, as it had a great influence in Germany, where it was called the Sturm und Drang movement, individual inspiration, and above all, the deep self, the notion that there is such a thing as a true self behind the vagaries of everyday experience. But aside from Mozart and Beethoven, we have poets like Shelley, Keats, and Wordsworth, in which we find, like as in the case with Rousseau, the notion of the individual's connection with nature. I'm thinking here particularly of a poem like "I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud." Thus, in isolation, the romantic impulse can be wonderful. However, combined with the soteriological impulse, it has contributed to a disastrous combination of ideas and especially feelings, and eventually, and can be traced to what eventually manifested itself as the social justice movement. Contemporary social justice movements, embodied by figures such as Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, appear to have abandoned reason altogether in favor of a discourse which combines a strong sociological motif, the notion that there was an original state of justice. We once were kings until the colonizers came, or there was an original matriarchal society that was pure, just, and innocent until patriarchy arose. So it regards the oppressor or the unpopular idea as some kind of a pollutant. And B, it combines this notion with strong emotional content for them, and for thinkers like them, including people like Judith Butler and our very own Julius Malema. There's a strong presence of evil among the powerful. They have artificially deprived the good, the pure, and the innocent oppressed from what is rightfully theirs. So again, just to remind you, this is known in philosophy as a metaphysics of intense moral dichotomies. It leaves very little room for interpretation, debate, or nuance. It isn't difficult to see, to trace the themes of anti-capitalism to Rousseau. In his second discourse, he begins by noting the variety of societies, from ancient Mesopotamia to Sparta to industrial England. Remember, England at this stage was more industrialized than France. And he concluded that humans, as good, pure, and innocent as they were capable of change, and they were by nature malleable. They could indeed change their identities at will.
Hello, everyone. We lost Dr. Louise Mabille for a moment. I just want you to know that we are trying our best to get her back on the Zoom call. So we are busy solving the problem. We will be back momentarily. Thank you.
Strangely, Rousseau abandons the notion of rational conduct altogether, turning to nothing short of the great apes, which many 18th century philosophers regarded as a prototype of early man. Anticipating Darwin, Rousseau held that the line between human and ape was less distinct than commonly appeared. Rousseau romanticized this version of primitive man, holding that they provided an alternative model to the decadent, overdeveloped European man. Unlike Hobbes, Rousseau held that natural men was something to aspire to, and that the ruthless competition depicted by figures like Hobbes and Locke were simply as a result of an unnatural state where pollutants like money were introduced. Now, Rousseau concludes that there's nothing natural about the institution of property or any form of social hierarchy. And it results through bad choices made by people in the past. So in this, Rousseau have something in common with Nietzsche in that it turns towards a kind of genealogical model to answer the most important questions. Now, this, in principle, this mistake of turning to private property and civilization could be undone. Now, Rousseau writes, the first who enclosed property and said, "This is mine," and found others simple and weak enough to believe him, was the true founder of civilized society. Don't let this impostor fool you. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the earth belongs to all and that the earth belongs to no one, not even to God. Even Voltaire was slightly taken aback by this. For Rousseau, natural man, originally had no concept of property or right. However, a few greedy individuals, which we could today translate in terms of white Christian European man, rather ambiguously, Rousseau was vehemently opposed to slavery, but these white European men were very cunning, articulate, and persuasive. And they managed to suggest that everyone join in a social contract, guaranteeing individual security under the rule of law. Now, law itself, according to Rousseau, is but a repressive construct with roots in artificial language and acts as a kind of false messenger. Now, oddly enough, Rousseau's theory of language holds that language too is corrupt because it too departed from original intent. The first noble savages, as Rousseau saw them, had no need for language. They could communicate in a purely transparent fashion through gesture. Now, gesture is for Rousseau the most originary form of communication, and he lamented the lack of transparency by which all modern European languages are afflicted. Now, strangely, he thinks that as languages go, the South, where the climate was warm and more human-friendly, had more transparent forms of languages. In the North, there was a greater sense of artifice present with unnecessary codes and disciplines, which we found in northern countries. However, this has since then been falsified, as we know by today that there's empirical evidence that there's no genuine evidence for finding an ontological difference between languages like Greek and Latin, as opposed to the Nordic languages like Russian. For Rousseau, writing was itself polluted and repressive, and it led to manipulation, lying, and deception. And it was once removed from genuine expression. Interestingly enough, none other than Jacques Derrida criticizes this notion of in his critique of the sign, stating that Rousseau contradicts himself and that he ultimately depends upon the very means that he criticizes in order to make his point. Now, Derrida, of course, speaks of a supplement. He says that Rousseau erroneously regards writing or even speaking as an unnatural supplement to an original real. And Derrida says that Rousseau, in essence, writes himself into the kind of double bind, upholding an ideal of transparency, purity, and origin that he could not even in principle ever attain. Perhaps the most blatantly anti-Christian of Rousseau's ideas are to be found in his novels, such as La Nouvelle Héloïse, named after the Héloïse of Abelard and Héloïse. This novel is a story about this, a tutor who seduces his underage pupil. The the girl eventually abandons the affair for a more upright, conventional bourgeois life, but is then punished by Rousseau by dying of pneumonia. And in this, he anticipates a later Frenchman, the Marquis de Sade, where the virtuous are always punished for their naivety. Now, in this particular novel, Rousseau expands upon a theme that would later appear in much of feminism and critical theory, that there is an original, true, natural relationship beyond between the sexes, and a more actual or real expression of both affection and sexuality that society, the church, and the demands of modernity in general have polluted. To some extent, you also find this in Freud, and it's taken up with gusto in the critical theories of figures like Herbert Marcuse, who thinks that it's possible to return to a kind of originary, real animalistic existence and use libidinal energy as a strategy of liberation. In conclusion, one could say that there's a very complex line of thought running throughout modernity, and that it is one of the most pervasive themes taken from Christianity, that there's a loss in the world from which humanity needs to recover. And this is why humanism as a philosophy, why there's no such thing as a pure humanism, but why it always has to retell a version of the Christian story at the hand of a number of ideologies, whether through Romanticism, critical theory, Marxism, feminism, or post-colonial theory. Finally, we could say that instead of compensating for the so-called repressions brought by Christianity and the church, all of these ideologies remind us of the limitations of our earthly existence, but it is only by bearing in mind that it is only temporary that that it's possible to retain any hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Louise. We apologize for the interruptions we had there, but thank you, Karnu, as well, and Louise for sorting everything out.
Oh, well, I apologize for not including the Gnostic elements in Rousseau and the social justice warriors.
Well, Louise, maybe I can start by just asking you a couple of questions, and we also have a couple of questions from some of the listeners in here as well.
Oh, excellent.
But I will start with this one. Is Romanticism essentially in competition with Christianity?
Oh, that's a very good question. Romanticism, properly understood, is a certain style, and it manifests itself aesthetically. So there's no reason to regard pure, or shall we say original, or one should be careful to, on account of all the postmodern theories on original, but there's no reason to regard Romanticism, a kind of love of nature, for example, as in competition with Christianity, as long as it isn't seen as a substitute for Christianity or a way to improve upon the Christian faith. As a matter of fact, we could find certain romantic elements in church architecture, the revival of Gothic architecture in the late 18th century as an example of that. So Romanticism is best left to the aesthetes, not to the moralists, and not to the theologians either, because it would be possible to find in liberal theology a kind of quasi-romantic notion that we are children of the earth, not of God. I'm sure the listeners have encountered this notion in liberal theology before.
Yes, no, for sure. Thanks, Louise. Another, maybe you can also just tell us a little bit more about the connection between, because you've spoken about Romanticism, but the connection between classicism and Romanticism.
Oh, okay. Classicism and Romanticism can be seen as two opposing stylistic approaches to life. When, if we look at ancient texts, we find that they have no such thing as what we today call the psyche. They just thought of the self as a being with a narrative of experiences. Something like figures like Achilles or Agamemnon wouldn't understand what we today call neurosis. It is, Michel Foucault has pointed out that the notion that there's a deep self, deep within yourself, is really a modern phenomenon. Throughout the ancient world and throughout the Middle Ages, the self was just seen as self-identical. You couldn't be alienated from yourself. And you can, I'm sure you pick up this vocabulary often used by the transgender movement, that you are alienate or estranged with yourself. Now, in the classical world, you are self-identical. You live an exteriorized life. With Romanticism, you live an interior life. You go into the great inner depths. Now, aesthetically speaking, classicism is about using aesthetic principles, being faithful to nature, looking at things like maintaining balance, proportion, and the like, whereas the Romantics emphasize feeling, passion, excess, emotion. A classical garden, for example, would be a formal garden, whereas a romantic garden would be, we just let things grow wild and see where it goes. So both of them were concerned with beauty. And again, this is another reason why we shouldn't abandon Romanticism entirely. as in with postmodernism, aesthetic standards have been abandoned almost in its entirety, but that's a topic for a different time. But you could say that it's the Greeks versus the Romantic poets, if you want it in a nutshell. It's different aesthetic styles, whether you feel, whether you're in the mood for balance and proportion or in the mood for wildness. That is the ultimate dichotomy between classical and romantic. So you could say Homer versus Goethe, if I could put it that way.
Cool. Thanks, Louise. Another question from one of the listeners. How does Dr. Mabille understand and respond to two central ideas of the social justice movement? That is the concept of internalized oppression and lived experience.
Okay, that's an excellent question. Internalized oppression is in itself, again, a romantic concept, something which can be traced to Rousseau. The idea that there is an internal self which could internalize a false experience of reality is a romantic construct. It's not an eternal, transcendental, that is a necessary or timeless truth, but that is in itself a construct, because the ancients had no notion that you could internalize a particular false idea. You just took reality as you experienced it. There isn't such a thing as disciplining yourself internally into seeing a false reality and experiencing a different one inside. The self was seen as continuous with reality. It's something that we still find in Thomas of Aquinas, where the self is directly connected to reality. It isn't about, there isn't such a gap between the internal self and external reality. And just the other term?
The other term was lived experience.
Lived experience, if I may be blunt, is a rather strange term. Again, every experience that anybody, there isn't such anything else besides lived experience. Everything that we experience is lived experience. This conversation you and I are having is a part of our lived experience. Again, there's a slight pseudo-romantic notion behind this term. The idea that if you oppressed or unfortunate or excluded or whatever the case may be, that there's something special about that person's lived experience. But you also have lived experience as upper class figures. It isn't possible to have anything else but lived experience. There isn't a gap between a real lived experience and a false lived experience. It is a pseudo-intellectual term that is used to give intellectual weight to a feeling of, to a self-righteous feeling of unhappiness, which Nietzsche would call resentment. So I would say it's Nietzschean resentment in its latest guise. It is, of course, perfectly possible to criticize society on reasonable grounds, but I think the term ultimately amounts to hot air.
Thanks, Louise. Wouldn't you say there's then, I know this term lived experience, it's also used to sort of try to gain the upper ground epistemologically speaking, like saying I have this lived experience which is unique to me as an individual. and nobody else shares that experience with me, and therefore I have some finer insight into reality that someone else who doesn't have my lived experience, they don't have this finer insight. So wouldn't there also be a Gnostic nuance there as well?
Yeah, absolutely, because Gnosticism is very cynical about reality. They think we are one removed from the from actual reality, and also that it should be possible that you have to dig for ultimate truth, because this world is fallen and deceptive. But the other thing that I would like to bring up, and it's from surprisingly a Marxist perspective. Now, if a person says that my lived experience is unique to me and only to me, then it makes absolute nonsense of Karl Marx, because Marx says that history is nothing more but the contrast or the a struggle between classes. But classes imply shared experience. How can society be criticized from a Marxist experience if, while millions of people share the same experience, even if it is one of oppression? If, furthermore, from an existentialist perspective, it would be possible to say that if experience would be truly, absolutely unique, then it wouldn't be possible to communicate it. For example, I'm taking a sip of water right now. If it wouldn't be possible to communicate that experience, how could I be sympathetic to a person who complains that he doesn't have access to clean water? If I don't understand, if it's so unique, then how can I even recognize the injustice when I see it? So no, that is a sly pseudo-intellectual term by people who have no real, don't have a sophisticated or developed social vocabulary.
Cool, thanks, Louise. That was insightful. Another question is there a connection between the Romantic movement and also then the modern day environmental movements, whether there might be a connection or not?
Absolutely, and there's a very interesting connection. Much has been said on the topic. The Romantic movement plays, as we've seen in our first slide, place a great deal of emphasis on the enjoyment of natural beauty, which I think is a good thing. It rejoiced in the wonders of nature, and it emphasized that we're part of it. The contemporary environmental movement is kind of problematic for me, because it certainly continues these themes, but there's this strange kind of, if I may use this term, alienation. Have you ever thought of the difference between the environment, which sounds like a very technical term? I mean, you could also speak of an office environment. It's just the place in which you find yourself. And the word nature. If you, from a Christian perspective, if you think of a writer like Tolkien, which word is he more likely to use? Environment or nature? I think the answer is clear: nature. Nature is a grander term, and it's something that you can be poetic about. But unless I'm mistaken, and I'm prepared to bet they would be very bad, nobody writes poems about the environment. So certainly there is this notion of continuation, but I would argue, if we were to recover a more authentic romanticism, a greater respect for the immensity and wonders of nature, and see it as part of our cultural heritage, we would achieve a great deal more progress than the technocratic language of that used by environmentalism. So in one sentence, yes and no. Yes, there is the rediscovery of nature as an authentic, as being in itself, as an autonomous field, something beyond humanity. But there's also a disconnect, a kind of a rationalistic approach, which doesn't gel very nicely together. And I think that's a problem with, shall we say, there's something spiritual left in nature, but not in environmentalism. And I would hope that we could recover that sense of the spiritual in nature as another way of God's revelation to us.
Cool, thanks, Louise. There's another question here. Since Marcuse's work is so central to the social justice movement, what would be the connection between Marcuse's work and the Romantics?
Okay, we could say that Marcuse is what I would call a dirty romantic. He takes the romantic theme of deep buried treasure within the human being that's been suppressed, even erased. And he uses Freudian, a Freudian language, the Freudian language of psychoanalysis, in an attempt to try and bring the original treasures to the surface. And so you could say is a more vulgar romantic in that sense, that he uses the movement of romanticism, but he conducts that his research in the vocabulary of Marxism and Freud. So you could say that he takes Rousseau to some extent into the 20th century. And whereas Rousseau, you could say, as foolish as he was in many respects, at least had something more poetic about him. This Marcuse is a very harsh, blunt, and dare I say it, unimaginative thinker.
Okay, thanks, Louise. I have more questions here. What was Rousseau's views on sexualities is another question from one of the listeners.
Okay. As I said, he wasn't as excessive as he's often painted, but both in La Nouvelle Louise, in his book on education, Emile, and in his personal life, he kind of advocated a position which is very similar to the 1960s notion of free love, that sexuality should blossom like a natural flower, free of any social constraints. And you could say that substituting the original saying of man is born free and everywhere he is in chains, you could say that for him, sexuality would be something free and everywhere it's in chains. And you would argue for a kind of, I would say, childlike, naive version of free love. I'm not sure whether, I think even Rousseau would be shocked by some of the versions that the notion of that free, in which free love manifests itself in our day and age, but the principle that social and societal constraints of sexuality would be in principle be wrong for you.
Okay, here's a question. Is there a connection between romanticism and relativism when it comes to notions like just be yourself, you have your truth and I have my truth, these kinds of notions? Is there a connection between that and romanticism?
Yes, to get back to the idea of the lived experience, romanticism holds that truth should be experienced, not ultimately objectively proven. It is something that every individual's truth, experience truth in his or her particular way. Note that the Romantics initially, you could also include figures like Diderot, even Voltaire to some extent, do not abandon truth. Initially, they thought that to go through every individual's self was another way of trying to get to truth. So, but feelings were for them as legitimate as reason. And that's where relativism comes in, the idea that feeling is a source of knowledge, which it obviously isn't. Now, of course, Rousseau in the 17th century wasn't subject to this plethora of different ideas and different lived experiences. So I don't think he ever really entertained the idea that this could lead to relativism, because in his age, the truths of the world were still very settled. It was still a question of the rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God saw all and ordered their estate. That idea was still present to a large extent, but the idea that you could remake the world in your own image, that your own experience is something special and legitimate and not to be and in principle not to be challenged, that idea is already there in its primitive kernel, in its original form.
Okay.
Yes, just for the record, somebody like Richard Rorty is sometimes called a romantic, a latter-day romantic.
Okay, that's interesting. Here's another question, Louise. The contemporary social justice scholars are hostile towards the nuclear family. Examples like Sophie Lewis. Is there a line or idea between Rousseau via the Frankfurt School that connects the hostility, this hostility towards the family?
Yes, and the line runs through the French Revolution. Now, Rousseau is one of the great inspirers of the French Revolution. And as I said, it's all in La Nouvelle Héloïse, the idea that to be free, you need to abandon all institutions, whether it's the family, the church, the courts, whatever the case might be. And Rousseau personally thought that it's impossible to be free while being tied to the nuclear family. In an infamous episode, he gave his 5 children away and sent them to an orphanage. But philosophically, Rousseau idealized the solitary individual. But during the French Revolution, the idea developed that one can not only get rid of the king, or the church, but of every institution in the history of humanity, and start from the beginning. And from there through the Frankfurt School, who saw the family as a kind of vehicle for capitalism. So there is a line of hostility to the of hostility towards the nuclear family. For many critics of capitalism, for some strange reason, it's always only the nuclear family that's associated with Protestantism, repression, free labor, or whatever the case might be. So yes, and again, this line goes through Marcuse and the notion of libidinal energy, the idea that if you free the libido from its constraints in the nuclear family, society would be free.
All right. Louise, here's another question. Was Rousseau a humanist? What was his attitude to God? That's another question here.
Rousseau is your classical humanist. It's a question of debate whether it was an absolute formal atheist or just an agnostic, but he certainly thought of man as the measure of all things, and that humans and their feelings, their experiences, less so their reason, was a wonderful phenomenon. And it should, he thought in principle of God as a kind of moral oppressor, a kind of spoilsport, somebody that you just need to get rid of as soon as possible.
All right. One question is also now focusing on feminism. What might be the key concepts that connect feminism with Rousseau, if there are any, for that matter?
Again, that's an interesting question. Rousseau was not what we would today call a feminist, not in his personal life, and he never really formally explored the concept of feminism, but he did hold that there's something that human essence is something wonderful in its own right and should be explored in every direction. So it opened up the way for feminism rather than, I would rather say it opened up the way than to say that Rousseau was officially feminist. In his personal life, he tended to live off aristocratic ladies who thought he was kind of a curiosity. So you could say in his personal life, he kind of sponged on women, and I'm not sure how feminist that is.
Thanks, Louise. One of the questions here is focusing also on the Enlightenment. What's the connection between Romanticism and the Enlightenment?
First, I would recommend a really good book, Continental Philosophy since 1750, which deals specifically with the question, but my short answer is that they are twin figures. They both manifestations of the spirit of humanism, which swept Europe in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Diderot, Baron d'Holbach, and so on, who emphasized rationality, while Rousseau focused on the emotional side, the unpredictable side of humanity. So they're the twin pillars of modern humanism, but they both place the human being as center stage.
Okay, cool. Louise, there's one last question, and that's what would be the influence of Romanticism in theology?
Well, I would say I've picked up in a debate that two South African theologians once had with the American scholars William Lane Craig and Michael Kona. There was a speech in which the South African liberal theologians spoke in a rather romantic way and appealed to the earth as a kind of mother figure, the idea of Mother Nature, as a substitute for Father God. That is, you could say, New Age theology is basically romantic in nature. It has the idea of whatever is flowing, exciting, nice, and soft must be true. So feel-good theology is in essence romantic. But as I said, there's proper romanticism, high romanticism manifests itself in architecture, in more in the Gothic style with, shall we say, in the 18th century, there were a couple of churches that were more dramatic in character. And that's not necessarily such a bad thing. You could think of it's the British Houses of Parliament. That style is an instance of romantic architecture, and the chapel at the Houses of Parliament would be an instance of that. So again, properly understood, romanticism can be something positive. It's totally possible for a Christian to also walk through the woods in the south of France or anywhere where nature is beautiful and feel a genuine connection with God through his creation. And that's not bad. We could say it's in the language of romanticism rather than making romanticism its essence. We can say that if you look at the look of something like Lord of the Rings, there is a kind of quasi-romantic style to it, these green rolling hills. You know that famous passage in Lord of the Rings where I think it's Bilbo speaks of Frodo's heart is still in the Shire. He loves its fields, its flowers, just the feeling. Well, that is good romanticism.
All right. Thank you very much, Louise. That's very insightful. Thank you for the lecture. Thank you for the listeners who tuned in. And yes, that wraps up our first event this evening. And again, Dr. Mabille, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Then you guys can tune in again at 8 o'clock this evening for our next lecture on the influence of postmodernism on biblical interpretation. Bye.